Okay, so chapter 8, behavioral economics, one of my absolute favorite chapters. It's the fusion of psychology with economics. It's a relatively newer field, and I'm excited to go over this chapter with you all. All right, so neoclassical economics, it's basically the economics that we've been studying in textbooks, the conventional branch, and it makes certain assumptions about human behavior. So, for example, um, people have preferences that aren't easily affected. Okay, basically, our preferences don't change very often. We don't give in to peer pressure or marketing or anything like that. People are eager and accurate calculating machines. Basically, we're really good at math, and we're really good at making big financial decisions and um, planning out our retirement and our future and making um, decisions to maximize our utility based on all the information possible. People are good planners who possess plenty of willpower. Okay, so again, you can kind of see how conventional economics does have its flaws. Okay, because we know in the real world that though there are people that are good planners with good willpower, there's lots of people who do not possess good willpower. And also, people are almost entirely selfish and self interested. Okay, that's the other assumption we have in classical economics. We always looking out for number one. Okay. So, given the past assumptions, we know that a lot of times people are actually um, generous, not always selfish and motivated. We also know that people do not always make the best decisions. They don't possess a lot of willpower, and that their preferences change or can be easily influenced. And so, um, what we saw with neoclassical economics is that people, instead of making decisions that maximize their utility, they would always make a lot of systematic errors. And so behavioral economics seeks to understand why those errors occur, and also try to show a little bit more human behavior in the economic models to better predict um, what future human behavior will be like. So, behavioral economics focuses on the mental process behind decisions. And once we understand what drives people to do what they do, then we can improve outcomes by improving decision making. Okay, so if we understand why we act a certain way or why we fail to do something we want to fail to do, we have to understand the mental process behind it. Okay, so let's look at um, neoclassical economics at the supermarket and at behavioral economics at the supermarket. Classical behavior at the supermarket would be, I'm going to go to the supermarket. I'm only going to buy what I need and only what I need. Um, and I would take into effect each price per unit and buy the good that gives me the most bang for the buck each time, and look past marketing and the way the shelves are displayed and maximize my utility. Okay, in reality, okay, I think a lot of us sometimes leave the supermarket with extra goods and items we really didn't need, or perhaps we don't buy the best bang for the buck item. Okay, because always doing the math per unit in your head can be tedious. Also, we're very influenced by marketing. Companies will bid against each other for having their products on a certain shelf, and shelves that are at eye level tend to generate more shelf more sales. Why? Because we like to go to the supermarket. We like it to be quick and easy and efficient. And so sometimes we end up buying a higher cost good just because it's just easier. Or in the checkout aisle, you see a magazine, you see all these gums, and you don't necessarily need it, but you end up buying them. Now, neoclassical economics and behavioral economics are not always at odds with each other. They're complementary. For example, neoclassical economics explains why the demand curve slopes downward. As price goes down, we buy more of a good. As price goes up, we buy less. And that is true. I mean, that is true in real life. Usually, when things become more expensive, we buy a lower quantity. And when things become cheaper, we buy a higher quantity. All right, so just looking at some of the differences in the way neoclassical economics and behavioral economics look at certain topics. So rationality, neoclassical economics, we always say that people are rational. Back in the last chapter, we assume that people are rational, and we are going to make decisions that maximize our utility, and we're not going to make errors. Okay, but you know what? People are people. We are human. We will make errors, and sometimes it's because we don't have the best information available. We do the best with what we can and what we know. It also, under the topic of stability of preference, we, of course, in neoclassical economics, I said before, people's preferences are not affected easily and they're stable, but in reality, people's preferences do change. They are inconsistent, and also things such as like advertising can change people's mind about a certain good. For capability for making mental calculations, people love to use their brain to make accurate calculations, and in reality, we're not so good at math, and we don't like doing it unless math is your hobby and you get a thrill out of doing math in your head. And so we do make systematic errors on that. Okay, ability to assess future options and possibility. Okay, basically, we are good at seeing in the future that as we are currently. In reality, what we found is that people place insufficient weight on future events and outcomes. We're more focused on the now than in the future. Strength of willpower. Okay. Classical economics is that, we resist temptation easily. Behavioral economics says that, we lack willpower and often fall prey to temptation. This is true. I mean, look at all the self-help books out there. Look at all the Instagram memes trying to motivate you to go to the gym and eat right. All that exists because people don't lack a lot of willpower and need constant encouragement. Under the topic degree of selfishness, it seems people are always self-interested and self-centered, but people are actually selfless and generous. I mean, of course, to different degrees, but sometimes people will give up an afternoon of their favorite leisure activity to go help out a friend move, for example, or volunteer their time. And on the topic of fairness, classical economics assumes that we do not care about fairness, and we only treat people well if we get something out of it. But in reality, people do care about fairness, and this has been proven in experiments we'll talk about later. And then we'll also give to people even if there's no benefits. Like a lot of people will donate to a cause anonymously, and so they get no, recognition for that donation, but they do it because, essentially they're not always selfish. Okay, heuristics are essentially mental shortcuts that we take. And this developed through evolution, trying to sit there and assess an option and think it through and calculate it was very time consuming, and it actually would consume calories. And back, in the hunters and gatherers stage, people needed to conserve calories, and so the brain developed mental shortcuts to help make decisions. However, because in the end it is a shortcut, it's more, when every time we use heuristics, we're But a trade-off is that it makes us more prone to human error. All right, so in some ways, the heuristics do help out. Is whenever we're playing catch with a ball, we don't sit there and our brain doesn't calculate, the speed at which the ball is, and using law of physics or whatever. We use the mental shortcut of keeping our eye on the ball and then catching the ball. Also, when we ride a bike, naturally, if we start to fall, our body goes in a direction of the fall to help stabilize us. The interesting thing with heuristics is that they appear to be hardwired into the brain, so they may not be able to be unlearned, or maybe they can, but it would take a lot of work. So it's hard for people to alter their bad behaviors. Sometimes we can get frustrated with someone and be like, but why can't they just change? But if that behavior is hardwired in their brain, then most likely they won't change. I guess that's why sometimes people will always say, people don't change, people can't change. Also, if someone understands the way you are and the way you think, they can try to exploit your vulnerabilities to get something from you. And one way that people can help make a positive behavioral change is that if they're put in a situation where the heuristic will kick in, and once again, it's a mental shortcut. It's almost like we're doing something automatically, and then they will automatically do something that leads them to the desired outcome. So our brains use two systems. The first system is system 1, and it's essentially your fight or flight response. It's the way we produce unconscious reactions. So if we see a snake or we see a grizzly bear in front of us, we don't usually sit there and analyze, okay, what type of bear is this? What type of snake is this? Is it, harmful, etc.? And then react. Usually we react by running away or attacking the snake or the bear. Well, hopefully you won't attack a bear, try to run from it. But, any way to protect ourselves, we don't really, think it through logically. It's just, once again, it's our fight or flight response. Now, system 2, okay, is the part of your brain that does think things through. Okay, it takes things slower. It looks at different angles of the problem, and it's part of the brain that does calculations, for example. All right, so there's many times conflicts between these. If you ever find yourself hungry and you devour a whole pizza in one sitting, and then regretting it later, and you're not feeling good, and you're beating yourself up over it, okay, then system 1 and system 2 are in conflict. And a lot of research has shown that most of our decisions are made using system 1, so basically our flight or fight response, versus system 2, which is the one that takes more time trying to think things through. And this results into cognitive biases. And what a cognitive bias is a misunderstanding or misperception that we have that cause systematic errors. Okay, so it's either because we're using system 1 thinking, which is prone to errors, or because we're trying to solve a problem which we don't have enough information for, or our brain was not designed for, we just don't have the capability or knowledge to do. One cognitive bias is a confirmation bias, and that's, we pay attention to information or studies that only agree with our beliefs, for example. So, we believe something and we want confirmation that it's true, so we will, only Google or research that is out there, or blogs with opinions that are out there that match our beliefs. So, if we believe that cookies are really, really good for you, then, we'll go to Google and type, cookies are really good for you. And, there might be an article or two saying cookies are great for you. And so you're like, see, I told you, cookies are great for you. I found this article that said so. So I'm going to ignore any other research out there that says, hey, maybe cookies are not so good for you. Okay. The second is leads to a self-serving bias, and that's essentially where we take credit for our successes, but we blame our failures on other. I mean, we don't like to be wrong; it doesn't feel good. Okay, so humans do have this tendency. Another effect is the overconfidence effect, and that's, we are overconfident in our decisions, and we are overconfident that our judgments and opinions are correct, and that our decisions were the best decisions and better than someone else's decision. And what studies have found is that, usually our judgments and our performance, our opinions, tend to not be as good or as correct as we thought they were. There's also the availability heuristic, and this is where we essentially over-focus on the low probability that something will happen to us. So, if you've been watching the news, we've seen several stories about airliners getting lost, or airplane crashes, or getting hijacked. And so, these events, compared to how many flights take off every day and make it safely, they're very rare events, but because we hear so much about it and we see the images, we tend to think that a probability of dying in an airplane crash, for example, may be higher than the probability of dying in an automobile accident, when in reality, we are much more likely to die in an automobile accident than we are in a plane crash. The planning fallacy is the tendency that we have to underestimate the time we need to do something. I don't know, I definitely sometimes fall prey to this. I recently cleaned out my whole house and threw out a lot of extra clutter, and the whole project took much longer than I thought it would. And I'm sure you might experience this when you get on Connect and think that, an assignment might take you 25 minutes, and it ends up taking you 50 minutes, for example. And then we have framing effects. We tend to think that things that are packaged pretty, or wrapped in expensive wrapping paper and tied with a pretty bow, are worth more than things that are not. It can even be such as, people think that people that dress a certain way are smarter or more creative, for example, etc., than people who don't dress a certain way. We have no proof that it's true, but we automatically come to that conclusion based on, stereotypes, which is a result of our heuristics. Brain wants to assess someone taking a shortcut versus actually getting to talk to them for a long period of time and logically thinking it through. We often judge good things that happen to us and not so good things that happen to us in relative terms. We judge it based on our current status quo. So if you're a student and your income is $15,000 a year, losing $5,000 would be a much bigger loss than, let's say, you were Bill Gates and you lost $5,000. $5,000 for a billionaire is probably not going to make as much of a dent in marginal utility or disutility in this case as it would in someone whose income is only 8,000. So what we find is that people experience both diminishing marginal utility for gains and diminishing marginal disutility for losses. Okay, so what does that mean? So basically, we gain the most marginal, or we gain the most utility with the first unit that we gained, and then every unit that we gain after, we still, experience increasing marginal utility, but not at the same rate. The first time you win a prize in a contest, you usually experience the greatest increase in utility then. You're like, wow, I can't believe I won. This never happens to me. But when you win a second or third time, you'll still have an increase in utility, but it won't be as high usually as the first time was. And then also with losses as well. The first time you go, let's say, to the casino and you incur a loss, okay, that first loss usually is the biggest marginal disutility, okay, biggest loss of utility, then the next loss will be. Okay, we almost kind of grow immune a little bit to successive losses or successive gains. But in general, people experience what we call loss aversions, and that means we feel losses greater than we do gains. So if you were to lose $100 today, we usually experience a greater drop in marginal utility than if we were to win $100 today. Some real life effects of prospect theory. First one is losses in shrinking packages. Okay, so firms need to be very careful about how they price their items. And this is because, once we get used to a certain price, any increase in price, we kind of see it as a loss relative to the status quo. Okay, so if I'm used to paying, for example, $2 for my coffee every day, and then all of a sudden it's $2.50, I experience a disutility, marginal disutility. I see it more as a loss over there. So a lot of times, and I've actually noticed this during the Great Recession, because during that time people were eating out less, so companies were earning restaurants were earning less revenue, but their food costs were increasing. It's that what companies do so they don't raise their prices is they just give you less of something. So I would go to restaurants and I would notice, okay, prices are the same, but the food on my plate was less. And at first I thought it was crazy until I talked to more people. And so, it's still a loss, right? Because when I pay the same price for the food, but there's less amount of food, then per unit, I'm paying a higher cost. So let's say per ounce of food, I'm paying a higher cost, but my System 1 brain doesn't think that way. All I'm thinking is, oh, okay, the price of my food has not changed. Now my System 2 brain, if I actually sit and think it out, be like, wait a minute, okay, I'm actually paying more per unit of food now than I was before. All right, so when we look at framing effects, how a question is asked, for example, or how a statement is made makes a huge difference. The book gives an example I really like, and it's, what sounds more appealing to you when you're buying hamburger beef? If it was advertised as 80% lean or as 20% fat, right? It's the same, okay, but at least for me, 80% lean definitely sounds more appetizing than 20% fat. Or even if it was advertised as just 20% fat, our brains are like, wait, what? What? Just 20% fat? That's a lot. Okay, so anchoring and credit card bills. Okay, so anchoring is our tendency that we have to unconsciously base the value of an item on recent information that we saw on another item, or just recent numbers that we might have seen in a totally unrelated and irrelevant event. Okay. at this experiment at MIT, people whose social security numbers ended in higher digits tended to give a higher estimate for a good than people whose social security numbers ended in lower digits. And that's because in the back of their mind, people with the higher digits anchored that information and carried it over to the item that was completely not related, but they somehow applied it to the new situation and valued the item higher than people whose social security numbers ended with lower digits. And this is why credit card companies, oftentimes have their customers pay very low minimum amounts. Like a customer might owe $10,000, but their minimum amount every month is $10. And you see that in your statement, like this is how much is due and this is the minimum payment due. And so, customers sometimes are very much suckered into this, and they do only make the minimum payment because, $10 sounds a lot better than making a $2,000 payment. We also want instant satisfaction, so we pay $10 now and use the money for something else. But in the long run, it's very damaging because, the longer we take to pay off our credit card bill, the higher the interest charges are. Ideally, when we make any type of financial decision, we look at our overall budget and our overall goals. But the reality is that we engage in what we call mental accounting, and that's when we look at certain financial decisions in isolation versus looking at the overall picture and our overall long-term goals. So sometimes, this is how companies are able to get us to buy overpriced warranties. You buy a brand new TV. Oh, if anything happens, here's a warranty. We can sell it to you for this much. And most of the time you won't end up using that warranty, and it's extremely expensive, and it takes away from your budget and goals. So even financial professionals will actually usually advise you against buying warranties. This is not me. This is not my recommendation, right? This is other people. So don't come back and say, hey, my TV broke within the first year and you told me not to buy a warranty. And we tend to buy protection because, we're afraid of a loss. It's fraying. Well, if anything goes wrong and you lose your TV, or especially with cell phones, or if anything goes wrong and you lose your cell phone, or with travel insurance, if anything goes wrong, you wouldn't want to lose this whole cost of the trip, even though most of the time, if you cancel within a reasonable amount of time, airlines will give you a credit. The endowment effect is the tendency to value items more once we own it. So for example, if you asked me to put a price tag on my friend's tablet, I might be like, I think it's $40, right? But if you ask me to put a price tag on my tablet, I'll say, no, I think it's worth more like $60. And once again, it's because, thinking about an item and the price, we think about how much of a loss it is when we give something away, and it just seems like when we own something, we value it much more. And we can even see that with like renting versus owning. I mean, it's been found that people that own their own house take care of their house better. They value it more than people who just rent a house. And then we have the status quo bias. Okay. And this is the tendency that we have to choose the option that is being presented to us as the default option. And the next slide will show a very good example of this. But another example would be, we tend to eat at the same restaurants. We know the food is good. We know the price of the food. So it tends to be the default option that we go to, or we're loyal to certain brands. We have gotten used to them. It's the default option. We don't want to think about other brands and have to research them, or potentially incur loss by trying out their product and not liking it. Okay, so here's an application of the status quo bias over here. So in Denmark, Netherlands, United Kingdom, and Germany, okay, being an organ donor is not the default option. Okay. Whereas in Austria, Belgium, France, Hungary, Sweden, Portugal, and Poland, it is the default option. When they're asked, if they don't reply, then they're automatically an organ donor. But in order for them to not be an organ donor, they would have to actually do the work of checking a box that says, no, I do not want to be an organ donor. Whereas in Denmark, Netherlands, United Kingdom, the default option is not being an organ donor. And if they want to be an organ donor, they have to check off a box saying, I want to be an organ donor. So this is a very powerful example of the status quo bias. We tend to choose the default option. Another behavior that neoclassical economics does not take into consideration is that humans tend to have myopia. This is nearsightedness. In other words, we're really good at satisfying our needs now at the trade-off of having something in the future. So for example, we get our paycheck and we're like, okay, I'm going to go to the bank and I'm going to put half my paycheck into savings. But in reality, when we get there, we might be like, well, I would be okay with only putting maybe a quarter into savings and, spending the rest. Okay, so we know retirement's in the future. We know it's going to come. We know that we need money for retirement. Okay, but we're not so good at planning for it. A lot of times we talk and we say, I want to be fit by this time, or I want to have school finished by this time, or, we want C, D, and E to be accomplished by this time. But, when it comes down to it, a lot of times our behavior is not very consistent with our future goals. We're very short-sighted and we're very tempted to please our current wants and desires versus being disciplined to get what we want in the future. So time and consistency, is when we misjudge now what we actually will end up doing in the future. And this could be the very near future. So I know the book gives an example of, you're going to get up, you're like, oh, tomorrow I'm going to wake up early and I'm going to hit the gym. But, the alarm clock rings and you're exhausted and you press it on snooze and you miss your workout. Or, tonight I'm going to study 3 hours of economics. I'm going to knock out all these assignments and learn smarts. And then, your favorite TV show comes on and you end up only getting 1 hour of work done. And time and consistency leads to self-control problems. Okay. You thought you wanted to go to the gym to be fit, but if you really wanted it so badly, you would have woken up early in the morning to do it, but you didn't. And so, the next day you're at dinner and you end up eating what you said you wouldn't eat, and that's because, once again, you misjudge what you truly wanted in the future. Or you said you wouldn't wait till the last minute at the deadline to do your Learn Smarts and your assignments, but you kept getting sidetracked and watching TV or going out with friends, and next thing you know, you only have 3 hours left until the deadline hits. That's just an example. I really hope that's not what is actually happening with you guys. So one way we can fight self-control problems is with pre-commitments. And, here it says hiding the alarm clock. Another pre-commitment, for example, with working out is I know that when I sign up for a class that I actually have to pay for, or when I agree to go with a friend, I really hate being flaky. I really don't stand people up. And so if I've already arranged to work out with a friend, or I pay for a class or a trainer, I'll be there. I am much more likely to go. Also, another way to help save for retirement, that way you don't spend your whole paycheck, is when you get paid, immediately have part of your paycheck go to a savings account or have it automatically deducted towards your 401k or whatever retirement plan. This is very important. We have to save for our own retirement. Companies don't really give pensions anymore. Social Security might not be around for our retirement. So, we are truly responsible for our own future income at the time we stop working. So, it's best to have a plan and a strategy to be able to funnel money into a retirement account and not spend it on anything. Another example would be going on with retirement is like early withdrawal penalties. If you withdraw funds too early from your IRA, for example, which is an individual retirement account, you get hit with penalties. And we don't like penalties, so that motivates people to keep money in their account. With salary smoothing is, I know when I was full-time at San Jack, my option was to get paid within a 9-month period because my contract was 9 months, or to spread those payments over 12 months. Okay, I chose 12 months. I'm an economist, I should be more disciplined, but I was worried, that getting that higher payment every month meant I would spend more, and so I chose to have my salary paid over 12 months. Also, weight loss competitions have been proven to be a good way to lose weight. When people are competing and they want to stick to their commitment and win, and so that's another way that you can stick to getting up early and avoiding early to work out, and then avoiding bad food at gatherings. All right. So like we said, neoclassical economics assumes that people don't care about fairness and they're just all about themselves. But in reality, people do care about fairness. In America, we are very generous with our donations to charities. And you can say, well, some people do it for recognition, and, that's not entirely false. But then there's also a lot of people that give money anonymously. We obey the law. Okay. We have many opportunities to run the stop sign and cut someone off, but a lot of times we don't because we want to be fair and kind. Also, fixing prices. So, there are some examples of during like a terrorist attack or a natural disaster of, some markets or suppliers of goods price gouging. A bottle of water is $100 all of a sudden instead of $2. But a lot of times sellers keep their prices the same or only have a slight markup. They know it's unfair and don't want to exacerbate that situation. Also, lately we've been more focused on buying fair trade products, and there's been a lot of documentaries out there exposing, the cruelty to animals that is done to them in order to be able to supply, for example, our eggs or our meat. And so, we're more conscious about buying animal products and where the animals killed more humanely, or buying clothes where the workers were treated more humanely, etc. Okay, and so, there have been experiments done for evidence for fairness, and the first one is the dictator game. Essentially, it's two players and it's anonymous, so the players never know who the other one is, and one person is the dictator and they get an amount of money, usually around $10, and that person gets to decide how much to split the amount of money, if any of it, to the other person. And since it's anonymous, it's not like the other person can retaliate. But what we find is, acting in pure self-interest, like neoclassical economics assumes, to maximize utility, right? The dictator should choose all $10. Like, no, it's mine. My utilities maximize the more money. But in reality, what happens with this game is they usually split it around 40, 60. You know, they'll give the other person about 40. They'll, $4, and they'll keep the $6. And some dictators even gave the other player the full $10, or they split it evenly. And so we see here that, people don't always act selfishly and in their own best interest. Now, the ultimatum game is, it's two players anonymous, just like the dictator game is. However, there's no dictator deciding how much the money split. Instead, both players have to actually come upon an agreement in how much money should be split. And what we find is that an unfair split, such as one person gets $1 and the other person gets $9, is, rejected as extremely unfair. Now, in neoclassical economics, someone, accepting $1 is better than $0, because you're better off with $1 than you are with no dollars. Okay, but in reality, people see that as an insult, almost as a slap in the face. They don't think that, hey, at least $1 is better than no dollar. They think as, oh, I'm being cheated. And what we find with the ultimatum game is that the splits that are proposed tend to be more equal than in the dictator game. So there is a little bit more self-niche in the dictator game, but in the ultimatum game, when two people have to agree, it tends to be more 50-50. And also, since both people have a say, like I said earlier, that unfair splits, or what they perceive to be unfair, are rejected with a lot of emotion. They're not like, oh no, that's not right, I reject it. They're like, what? It's an insult to me. How could you only offer me $1? That is wildly unfair. Sorry, got a little emotional and ahead of myself here. So people hate rejection. We should know that. A lot of behaviors in life are based on being afraid of rejection. It's sometimes why we don't speak our mind, or we don't want to talk about religion or politics anywhere. And so what we see is that in the ultimatum game as well, because people don't want to be rejected, they tend to start off with very fair splits to begin with. It leads to more cooperation, social cooperation. Also motivates producers to produce products that are fair to consumers given the price. Given all this information that we have, we can help, what we say, nudge people towards making decisions better for themselves. So like with saving money, if we make funneling money into your retirement, or funneling part of your paycheck into retirement as a default option, then, as we said earlier, the status quo bias, people tend to go with this default option, and so they will tend to be more likely to stick with a plan to save money. Also, if you signed up for a worker class first thing in the morning, if their policy is if you don't cancel within a certain period of time, then you have to pay for the class anyways. That helps people stick with going. And this is a lot of times even with like doctor's appointments, if there's always like a no-show type of fee. And so once you know that there's a cost associated with it, and we see a cost like that as a loss, we tend to be more willing to show up for our commitments. All right, this concludes chapter 8.